Let's welcome him. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mount Olive. Excuse me. Before I begin, I do want to extend my thanks again to Reverend Dr. Eugene Johnson. I don't know if Pastor Johnson is present, but I certainly enjoyed our time of fellowship at last year's African American History Month program, and want to extend my personal thanks to Pastor Johnson, as well as Miss Crystal Arful-Ado, who again was so helpful again this year in ironing out the logistics and back and forth with emails and various types of correspondence and communication, doing so much to make me feel so welcome. So I just want to say thank you to her also, and to everyone else who participated, to the committee members of the Black History Month program. To that committee, I thank you for having me here. Today, I'd like to talk about two things in particular. I'm going to attempt to weave two themes. One is the theme of this particular event, and that is the struggle has always been real. And I'm going to talk about the long legacy of the Black freedom struggle. But I also want to talk about the legacy of the Black freedom struggle in conjunction with the larger theme for Black History Month this year, and that is the theme of migrations. As you all are aware, and I've read on the back of the program for this event, 2019 marks the 400-year anniversary of the first forced migration of African captives to North American soils. And as I understand, those 19 indentured servants, or who would later become enslaved Africans, landed in the state right here in this state of Virginia. I want to see if we can talk about how these two themes, the Black freedom struggle and this story of migrations, can be intertwined. Now, it was mentioned in the wonderful introduction that I'm currently working on a book project, a biography of the Reverend John Marrant. And so I'm going to share with you some of my initial findings. You're getting a sneak preview of what's to come. But as I unfold some of Marrant's life and relay some of his story to you, I'm going to do so in a way that tries to tie in these themes and broader themes of African American religious history. Now, one of the things that we typically do during African American History Month, particularly when we're trying to teach young people about African American history, is we review a litany of facts, right? We might ask them what year this particular event took place that was a landmark event in African American history. Or we might ask them if they can name certain inventors. Another favorite Black history fact game is to see if we can name who was the first African American, or what was the first Black this or that in American history. So I'm going to play a little game with you all just to see if you're paying attention. In this presentation and in this lecture, I'm going to mention at least 3 African American firsts. And these are 3 of the facts, at least 3 of the facts. And I want to see if at the end of the lecture, we can name at least 3 of the African American firsts that will be covered in this lecture. One of the reasons that I really appreciate the opportunities to talk about this type of work in these types of settings is because, in a lot of ways, academia separates you from your community. Academia and higher education is really not designed to encourage independent thought, particularly by folks who look like us. And so one of the compromises that many scholars, particularly scholars of color, have to make is that they have to abandon their communities in order to pursue their professional and academic goals. And that creates a divide and a rift between scholarly communities and communities of faith. I'm very clear about which community has helped to shape me and make me who I am. I'm also very, very clear about my vocational and professional calling. I don't believe that those two worlds have to be separate. And so I really appreciate you all allowing me to come into this space, because you allow me to walk in my purpose, which is to bridge these two worlds. And so this is what I'll try to do as I talk to you today about the life of the Reverend John Marrant. The brief but adventurous life of the Reverend John Marrant, North America's first Black ordained minister, provides a glimpse into the earliest documented accounts of Black religion in American history. Marrant's journey begins in New York in 1755, where he's born free, and ends in London in 1791. In 1785, he was ordained as a Methodist minister in Bath, England, in the Huntingdon Connection, the earliest ordination on record for any Black person born in North America. He also built churches and a school and pastored congregations of former slaves in Nova Scotia, Canada. He was the first chaplain to the Prince Hall Freemasons in Boston, Massachusetts, the oldest lodge established by Black Freemasons anywhere in the world. Marrant published 2 autobiographical texts, and each reveals religious themes, symbols, and practices that inform the formation of the Black church in America. His extraordinary career cements his legacy as a pioneer within the Black church and the broader field of African American religious history. But despite Marrant's extraordinary career, his early life was characterized by continuous movement and forced migrations brought about by social upheaval and political instability common to African Americans during the nation's early history. You see, Marrant's father died when he was just 4 years old from an unspecified cause. Although his hometown of New York had a significant free Black population at the time, there were limits. The limits on Black people's freedom were tightening quickly, and the absence of their father likely threatened the family's safety. Before he turned 5 years old, Marrant's mother moved the family 700 miles away from New York to North America's first all-Black settlement, Fort Mose, which was just 2 miles north of St. Augustine, Florida. There, Marrant started school and learned to read. He was most likely taught by Catholic missionaries who'd established Black Catholic congregations throughout the Spanish colonies. However, military conflicts between Spanish and British imperial forces left the Fort Mose community in disarray, and the Marrant family found it necessary to move to Savannah, Georgia, in the recently formed colony after only a year and a half. They remained in Georgia for nearly 6 years until Marrant turned 11. There, he also attended school and was nurtured in the developing faith of Black Baptist converts like George Lyle and Andrew Bryan, 2 of the earliest founders of Black Baptist churches in the American South and the Caribbean. However, by that time, Georgia, which had initially forbidden or outlawed slavery in the colony, had now become a slave territory. And this new development prompted the Marrant family to relocate to Charleston, South Carolina, which boasted the largest free Black population in colonial America at the time. It was in Charleston that Marrant came under the power of God at a revival meeting where he witnessed the preaching of the Reverend George Whitefield, the renowned Methodist minister. Now, if you were here last year, you might remember that I talked about the Brush Harbor, and I talked about John Marrant's and others. I talked about Douglass and Frederick Douglass, and I talked about Nat Turner, and I talked about this theme in African American religious literature in which these prophetic figures would endure wilderness initiations. And so this is the point in Marrant's life after he meets George Whitefield and after he experiences the initial call of God. This is the point at which Marrant undergoes this initiatory phase phase, okay? And so I'm not going to go back over that, but for those of you who recall that, this is the point at which now the wilderness enters, okay? And so some of you remember something, some of that. If not, it's not. You'll still be able to understand this without having that. But just what I do want you to understand is that after he experiences his initial call, he goes through a period of initiation and purification to prepare himself for the next phase in his journey, okay? And I'm gonna say that again. So after he experiences the presence of God and the call of God for the first time, okay, he undergoes a period of purification and initiation to prepare himself for the next phase of his journey, okay? The other thing I'd like to point out is at this stage in life, John Marrant is 14 years old, okay? He's 14 years old, and he's lived in 4 different cities. He and his family have not been able to find stability through no fault of their own, right? Just the forces of nature, the forces of society, the forces of history have tossed them to and fro throughout the North American continent, okay? And so what I want to impress upon you at this juncture is that the narrative of African American dislocation ain't nothing new. That struggle has always been real. Now, as Marrant reflects on his series of forced migrations during his early life, he realizes, quote, "The Lord spoke to me in my early days by these removes, if I could have understood him, and said, here we have no continuing city." Marrant's revelation regarding the elusive continuing city or promised land for African Americans is an important theme in Black religious history and underscores a critical relationship between social history and religious development. Consequently, this introductory material cannot be overlooked because it provides the historical context from which his life takes meaning. Marrant's migrations in his early life are a metaphor for the instability, rootlessness, and uncertainty that characterize Black people's everyday existence in colonial America. The trauma of forced migration was part of the shared narrative of experience that gave birth to African American identity broadly, but African American religious identity in particular. As Marrant reflects on his migrations during his early life, he surmises that his continuous movements are neither a series of unexplained misfortunes nor a matter of mere circumstance, but rather the result of divine intention. Not only was the struggle real, but it seemed to be designed by God. Perhaps Marrant wondered, like the biblical character Job, why the struggle was even necessary in the first place. I mean, why does life have to be chaotic, unsettled, and seemingly governed by injustice? I imagine many contemporary Black Christians would be sympathetic to Marrant's seeming frustration with the lack of stability that categorized his early life. For it seemed that every time Marrant and his family moved to advance in society, they were met by some oppositional force. In fact, slow developing and short-lived progress is a common theme to the Black freedom struggle in America. When the first African slaves arrived to this country, in this state, their struggle against enslavement was so real that it sometimes took on forms of violent resistance. In places like New York, South Carolina, Virginia, and Florida, African slaves rebelled against their captors and sought to win their freedom by force. While these early efforts constituted the foundation of the Black freedom struggle, temporary success was countered by legal codes that further restricted Black freedom and cemented their status as slaves in perpetuity. In 1808, British abolitionists agitated to bring an end to the international slave trade, which meant that Africans could no longer be forcibly removed from their home continent and brought to America as enslaved laborers. That seems like a step forward. However, this development gave rise to the internal trade within America, and as a result, enslaved black laborers were stripped and sold away from their families to meet the growing demand for labor now that the African supply was cut off. So there's the step backwards. When the American abolitionist movement reached its zenith during the 1830s and 40s, pro-slavery advocates countered by introducing the Fugitive Slave Bill in 1850, which authorized slave owners and slave catchers to travel to the free states of the North, most of which had by now abolished slavery, to recapture and re-enslave runaways who'd made their escape to freedom. The political fallout from the legal battles over the law contributed to the onset of the Civil War, when the nation would decide the fate of the peculiar institution on the field of battle. The Union victory secured the freedom for the nation's nearly 4 million black slaves, and the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments during the period of Reconstruction led many slaves to believe their dream of liberation would be fully realized. But their hopes for full citizenship and inclusion were dashed by new systems of forced labor and discrimination called the convict lease system and Jim Crow society. The struggle has always been real. But the struggle didn't stop there. As legalized segregation and state-sanctioned violence ruled the South in the early 20th century, black people migrated north in search of better opportunities. The Great Migration constituted an exodus from the former land of bondage to the land of opportunity. In northern urban centers, beginning in the 1920s, black migrants created a cultural and artistic revolution called the New Negro Movement, perhaps better known as the Harlem Renaissance, where writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, and Countee Cullen articulated new visions of black humanity. Renaissance, rebirth, reawakening, coming to a new understanding of consciousness. Long before Black Lives Matter activists and advocates exhorted one another to stay woke, black people had awakened to understand that their collective and individual destinies were tied to their efforts to struggle together. Black folks been woke, and the struggle has been real. The art, poetry, novels, music, and other forms of expressive culture they created gave rise to the political consciousness of the civil rights generation of the 1950s and 60s. But this move forward was also met by the counter-resistance of mass incarceration and the economic destabilization and displacement of black households and communities, or gentrification, a phenomenon that is ongoing in many of the nation's leading cities. The ebb and flow of the history of struggle is observable when one considers that the hope of a new future inspired by the election of Barack Obama was followed by the resurgence of white supremacist ideology in the age of Trump. Black folks' struggle for freedom in America has always been real and continues to be real to this day. Now, if you're anything like me, perhaps you also understand why Marrant might have been frustrated with the lack of stability and his seeming inability to consistently move forward in his own life. Why do the events of history, which are seemingly beyond my control, seem to determine my outcomes despite my best efforts to the contrary? Why am I not powerful enough to overcome this turmoil and truly find a free existence? Well, in Marrant's case, the political and social turmoil that had determined so much of the course of his life did not stop there. While Marrant was living in Charleston, earning a living as a carpenter and plantation preacher, the British Navy arrived to put down the rebellion of American colonists who fought for their inalienable right to liberty while they held their slaves in chains. the British governor of this state of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation which stated that any slaves who rebelled against their masters and fought for the British against the American colonists would be granted their freedom. Thousands of enslaved blacks responded to Dunmore's call, joining the ranks of the British. John Marrant, however, was pressed or drafted into service in the British Navy. After 7 years at sea, he was discharged in London, where he was ordained in the Methodist Church. Shortly afterwards, he was called to Nova Scotia in Canada because a community of formerly enslaved blacks had been recently settled there and were in need of a minister to meet their congregational needs. You see, although the British lost the war, they honored Lord Dunmore's proclamation and resettled the former slaves in their territories in Canada in exchange for their military service during the war. This collection of slaves was diverse and arrived from all over the United States. They had been evacuated from places like Savannah and Charleston, New York, and Richmond. And let me emphasize the significance of the various places from which they were evacuated. Different populations of African people, by and large, resided in different cities in North America. And so when these evacuees arrive in Canada, what you have is, you have Africans from Sierra Leone who had been enslaved by the Dutch in New York, showing up trying to congregate and mix with Angolans who were from West Central Africa, who'd been enslaved by the British in Barbados, Georgia, and South Carolina. So there are language and cultural barriers that have to be overcome. Additionally, we're talking about a largely uneducated and unskilled population whose primary means of production is agricultural. Guess what? They're not farming in Canada. This is the ragtag bunch of dispersed, formerly enslaved people that John Marrant has to transform into a community of faith. Although they shared the common experience of enslavement, they were strangers to one another. How could this mass group of uneducated, unskilled group of strangers ever become a community? How could they ever become a people? Well, John Marrant arrived, and to him, these people were not strangers. He could relate to these people because he had been in all the places that they had come from. When the African slaves arrived from New York, he knew the history of conflict that categorized their social existence during the 18th century. The stories of the New York riots of 1712 and 1741 were likely familiar to him because that same social history prompted his family to move. I imagine he helped to ease the transition of settlers from Florida who had grown accustomed to Catholic rituals and styles of worship as longtime residents in the Spanish colonies. Certainly, he could relate to the stories of displacement shared by those who'd resettled from the low country of Georgia and South Carolina. The military conflict between the British and the Americans had forced him from his home as well. Like the black settlers in Nova Scotia, he knew what it meant to be a stranger in a new land. His personal narratives of voluntary and involuntary migration enabled him to adapt to new people and places quickly. As a result, he was equipped to form this group of strangers into the people of God. And so, when he arrived to Nova Scotia, he began preaching and baptizing families. He administered communion and established regular worship. He tended the sick and daily conversed with community members in their homes. He secured provisions to ensure that they could build a school and a meeting house for worship. Marrant told his congregation of former slaves that by the grace of God, quote, "You stand with the greatest kings that have ever faced the earth." By the time of his untimely death in 1791, his congregation in Canada was so formidable that they organized themselves to migrate to Africa to establish an evangelical colony, Christian colony, on the coast of Sierra Leone. Marrant's example demonstrates that struggle, while unpleasant, can produce faith of immeasurable value. Faith born from struggle has the power to transform. John Marrant, whose own life began with the instability of forced migration, helped transform his people, a group of former slaves who formerly could not cross the boundaries of the plantation, into a self-determined community that voluntarily crossed an ocean. Like Moses, and in anticipation of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Marrant would not live to see the promised land with his people. But they were delivered home after his death as a result of the work he had done. Marrant gathered the skills needed to lead his people at each stop along the journey. And at every stop, and although every stop was not pleasant and every transition was not smooth, instead of complaining about being tossed and fro, perhaps what we should ask on our journey is, what are we gathering on this journey, and who are we meant to serve with our collections of talents, skills, and experience? Now, I'm here at the point where I'm ready to conclude, but before I do, I want to go back and give you an opportunity to see if anybody was able to pick on at least three facts, one of the three facts. Does anybody remember one of the three facts? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the young lady said that I mentioned that there was the first all-black settlement in North America. Does anybody remember where that was? Fort Mose, which is in Florida. There's a Fort Mose historical park that commemorates some of this history that still exists, but it was a settlement, a colony settlement 2 miles north of St. Augustine. Anybody remember another one? Any other one? She also mentioned something about John Marrant being the first ordained minister born, first black ordained minister born in North America. Now, if you caught those facts, I'm glad. If you didn't catch them, that's okay, because those are the facts, but that ain't the point, okay? Now, let me give you the point. Point number one, the struggle for black freedom that has categorized black people's existence in America is real. Please understand that black people in America turn to religion, to Christianity in particular, to aid them in their struggle for freedom. In other words, the primary and fundamental orientation was to freedom, and religious faith was a path to freedom and wholeness. You see, part of the legacy of white supremacy and slavery in America is that it left communities fractured and incomplete. Christian faith in the black church aims to make whole that which was rendered broken by the sin of white supremacy and injustice. Point number two, the black freedom struggle is a sacred legacy. It is critical that we understand that black people in America are no more or less sacred, holy, or important to God than any other group of people on earth. I'm going to say that again. It is critical that we understand and teach to our children that black people in America are no more or less sacred, holy, or important to God than any other people that have ever existed, past or present. We are as much the chosen people as any other people that's ever lived on this earth. Black history is more than a collection of facts. There are moral and ethical lessons embedded in the stories of our ancestors, and they are of tremendous spiritual value. It's our job as leaders to know and to teach the institutional histories and spiritual legacies from which we emerge. Jesus warned people not to make idols of family histories and genealogies, but he didn't instruct them to do away with them altogether. In fact, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, Jesus' messianic identity is confirmed because the people know the generations of succession. Throughout the Old Testament, Israel is reminded to remember their past, that God once delivered them from bondage, and that there was a historical legacy of struggle to which they could turn to draw strength and confidence to know that they would be delivered again. We have such a legacy as Black Christians in America, but we must value it and make it central to our worship and identity. And my final point, struggle produces transformative faith, a necessary ingredient for restoration and renewal. A new believer cannot experience the transformation of a renewed life if he or she does not first possess faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. But with faith, all things are possible. Stories of personal or individual struggle are often rooted in the larger struggles of a community. Marrant's personal traumas of displacement reflected the shared narrative of forced migration that is foundational to African American identity. He utilizes his own experiences of adapting to new situations and his skills as a community builder to transform the diverse group of strangers who were once slaves into a free society of citizens capable of determining their own collective destiny. Marrant's struggle produces a faith that leads his community from the harsh winters of Canada to the promised land on the coast of West Africa. Therefore, the church must engage in practices that lead to communal healing and restorative justice. I'd like to close with the words of an unnamed poet who sums up the importance of the spiritual legacy of African American religious history as such. Swing low, sweet chariot, I see Harriet coming forth to carry us to freedom land. We demand justice and equality so that all who follow me can make good on the promises. The struggle yet lies in front of us. For too long they've taunted us with the whispers of liberty, but only God can deliver me. Surely we will see the Lord's purity, but only after we've been refined in the fire. In the meantime, we acquire wisdom through the spiritual discipline of listening. It's the poor and the sick we're visiting, ever envisioning a bright tomorrow. For we know that morning's joy only comes after a night of sorrow. If it's the light of Christ we follow, then our law is love and our way is peace. And in his name, all oppression shall cease. Thank you, Mount Olive. I appreciate you having me here.